What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Christian Mystic Podcast. I have with me Bob Peck from Original Sin is a Lie on TikTok, and he is also the author of the book Original Sin is a Lie. Author, producer, writer. Um, give him a warm welcome. This is Bob Peck. How's it
Thanks
going,
so
man?
much, Sean Tyler. I'm thrilled to chat with you and just deep bow, man, to your work. I really appreciate what you're doing with kind of esoteric Christianity and just the mystical threads within the Abrahamic traditions. There's so many fundamentalist, dogmatic, evangelical Christians in this country, and God bless them. And you know, I think they hopefully can get a lot of benefit out of your work and some of what I'm doing as well.
Well, we do hope so. So a lot of your main concept is original sin is a lie, which I mean I've found that the dogma of original sin, it's quite problematic, and it leaves room, for kind of an argument between um original sin that's innate within someone else and free will, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, that's interesting. Admittedly, the title is a little somewhat misleading in that. So actually, a friend of mine who's become a friend got the book, and he said, I initially thought the whole thing was going to be about just the doctrine of original sin and kind of
Right.
decoding it. And that's not quite what my book is about, although it is a central theme of my book and my work. It really has more to do kind of broader with kind of world mystic philosophy and which really the key component of particularly, as you well know, particularly Eastern spirituality is that we are inherently good, that we are inherently love, even if you will, that we're a part of the creator, and kind of
That we
almost
all have a
inescapably, right?
Yeah, that we all have a divine spark within us. I get that.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly, and that's a huge part of Hindu philosophy, which is really kind of foundational for me. But Buddha nature, it's present all over the place, and yeah, I think just kind of seeing the fact that a lot of kind of American Christians take that, dirtiness, that inherent dirtiness, is such a core concept of Jesus' teaching, when in reality, he said zero things in the New Testament about original sin. In fact, he says arguably the opposite in Luke 17:21. He says the kingdom is within you. It's original sin comes from Augustine, who's
Right.
about 300 years later. And Augustine was reading Paul, and he was reading some Genesis and so on, but it's a doctrine that formed much later than the master.
Right. It's
And
man's knowledge when I tell people, you should listen to God instead of what man's come up with. Yeah,
that's
exactly.
beautiful. That's beautiful. So yeah, so the first part of my book that like you said is kind of my life's work so far. It came out this past year in September 22. And so yeah, the first chapter or two really is about kind of original sin and Christian doctrine, but it gets into larger spiritual philosophy pretty quickly.
Yeah, I could see that. There's quite a magic with what we're working with the sacred secretion and the studying it and how it's in all philosophies and all religions, not just the Abrahamic religions and Abrahamic faiths. And we see a huge parallel between, the mystical idea of the logos in John and the Tao, or even, and you can pull all kinds of different synonyms that from tantra to um gnosis to theurgy to but it's all essentially the same process as in Eastern mysticism. It's a very um how would I put it? It's a profound story that's written in the cycles of time. And so therefore every culture has ended up picking up
Beautiful.
some form of this knowledge and this information. And God's not naive. There's nothing new under the sun. He didn't, this stuff didn't just up and show up. It's been around since the beginning. So from the beginning, he planned on using this, as with my studies within Colossians 1, 26, or really just Colossians 1:20, you could read that entire from about 20 to first no Colossians 30, and you will get the whole message of the gospel of the kingdom, which is Christ in you. It's the hope
Mm,
of glory, and glory is the Shekinah. Glory is the oneness of God, and it's also alluded to um, being reminiscent of a spiritual sun. So you can find that all over in Hindu philosophy with Surya and let's see, even technically, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva are all different archetypes of the sun. So it's almost like I tell people it's almost like God played trumps, so to speak, if you want to, at least in my view. And it's like the amalgamation of two different companies, where there's a company of the Gentiles, the pagans, the common people, and then there's a company of the Israelites at that moment. Well, when Jesus died, he amalgamated the entire world. It said, for God so loved the world, not just God so loved an area or God so loved the race. It wasn't about that. And yeah,
right. That's
yeah,
beautiful. Yeah, I think, to your observations there, and really, I'm in pretty much complete alignment with you, my friend. Once you start studying the other spiritual traditions, what's called the perennial philosophy, right? Aldous
yeah,
Huxley,
the magnum opus. Yeah,
right. It's so, there's so many parallels kind of on the symbolic level, that it's almost frustrating to me, in a sense, that we're still kind of riddled by exclusive doctrine. It's like,
yes.
you really guys, kind of just gotta to read outside of your own kind of
It's like it
upbringing
takes one heck
tradition.
of a box to put yourself in to really be isolated from this kind of information.
Totally. and
Yeah,
and and I would say that too. you know I wouldn't necessarily want to be too judgmental about that, because I know a lot of people are kind of working through really real trauma in their religious upbringing. I've
yeah,
been fortunate to meet people who have, kind of, most of the people I've been talking to the past year or so through TikTok have been kind of the folks that came out of it and said, kind of Plato's cave, if you will, that
yeah,
there's still a lot of people in the chains looking at the wall and the shadows, and so sending compassion to them, and
absolutely.
non-judgment and gentleness, but at the same time encouraging, um, your listeners, and really anyone that has the call or the intuitive interest to be exploratory, because there's a lot of real beauty and richness kind of across the world traditions. Yeah.
Right, absolutely. And I feel like I was gonna mention something about my channel. I kind of lost my train of thought.
Well, I was going to mention, actually, even before I said that, which is, it's funny you said logos and Tao.
Oh
So
yeah.
I have a subchapter in my book called The Spiritual Gospel of John, Its Beauty and Its Issues. John's complicated. There's
Mhm.
some challenges a bit around it, but there is some beauty to it. And I specifically reference, just pulling up my book here. I specifically reference the Logos as having similarities to the Tao and similarities to the Rig Veda. One of the openings lines of the Rig Veda is, "In the beginning was the Lord, and second to him was the Word. The Word was truly the supreme Brahman." I mean, that's
That's
almost
wild.
identical to John 1.
Yeah, that's
It's
very
pretty
identical. It's
crazy.
almost like
Yeah.
he took a little bit of it or something. Maybe he
It's
was
hard
inspired.
to not
Yeah.
make the connection that
Yeah,
closely, to
that's
be
that's
honest.
very close. Yeah,
Yeah.
even using the word. The
Mm-hmm.
word was in the beginning. Yeah.
Unreal. Yeah. 1900, estimated 1900 BCE for
Mm,
Rig Veda. So
okay. I'm not too big on studying the Vedas, although I want to. I just haven't had the opportunity to. I don't have a copy of the Vedas personally.
they're
I
a
used
bit
to have,
more Iron Age.
yeah, yeah. I used to
They're
have a
more
copy of the Bhagavad Gita and I've lost it.
the Gita. I highly recommend. So the Vedas are extremely early, and they're almost with respect to, real scripture and then the Vedic philosophy, it's all based on them. But a lot of the kind of rituals prescribed in the Vedas seem to be in an earlier civilization time period, whereas the Upanishads have, the Vedas have more to do with ritual, and the Upanishads are a few centuries later that have more to do with the mental capacity and the spiritual capacity. So
Yeah, they
the
had really
Upanishads are more worth studying, in my view.
they had quite intricate rituals to my knowledge, from just studying them. They had fire altars that they would put up in, and in the ancient times they didn't have a compass or anything like this. They would actually draw out the directions using the sun of the magnetic poles of the earth, and they would build it on
A lot of
sacred
sophistication.
geometry.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's crazy. I mean, even altars today in like Wicca and other places, they even, situate their altars facing north or whatever, what have you. But that comes from that ancient Vedic science that was original.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. So a little bit about maybe Christ figures in other religions that you've studied, or in Eastern mysticism.
Sure. I mean, yeah, I'm really into, kind of my three are Krishna, the Buddha, and Christ.
Okay.
I don't really need much more than that, to be honest. Each individual is more than sufficient. So I'm not as intimately familiar with traditions outside of those guys. But those three, to me, I have a chapter called the Avatars. In Original Sin is a Lie, and basically what I do, first of all, I refer to, I think it's chapter 4 in the Gita, when Krishna tells Arjuna, which is the framework for the Gita, that it's just a conversation between Krishna, who's a divine figure. Just for your listeners' context, Krishna is kind of a Christ-like figure in ancient India, and Arjuna is this great warrior, and they're having a conversation on a battlefield. And Krishna basically is kind of comforting Arjuna and reassuring him of the way things work and the eternality of the soul and all this beautiful kind of duty and dharma and so on. And in chapter 4, he says, when wickedness takes foothold, I rise. And it's kind of it's called the Avatar Doctrine. It's what the mystics and kind of other Hindu masters point to say that's every religion's founding, and there's unknowns too, I believe personally, but there's a very high being that manifests on earth when it's needed. This is the duality plane, right? So when evil gets too fierce, it creates a pendulum like energy
Effect,
of
yeah. The
needing
opposite.
a being of light. And I think in Hinduism and world mysticism, that capacity is we're all capable of it.
Yeah, and bringing that to Jesus, the story of Jesus, that
Right.
around his time the Romans were oppressing his area.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And the Jewish religion was becoming kind of empty and wooden in some
Yeah.
qualities, as he points out. And the Buddha, interestingly enough, the Buddha does a similar thing kind of with the Vedic ritual. To your point about the fire rituals, the Hindu religion of the time of the Buddha was becoming dogmatic, and there was a lot of ascetics who were kind of missing the point. They were kind of starving themselves, but they weren't starving their, what the Buddha says is, well, the detachment isn't from food, the detachment is from your emotional
It's
connection.
interesting that you said they were missing
They're
the point.
reformers. Yeah.
Missing the point is the word used for sin in the New Testament. Is
Mm,
harmashia, missing
missing
the
the
mark,
mark.
like an
Right,
archery
right.
term. It's like, oh, you
That's
missed
right.
the point. That's literally what that was. Yeah.
Yeah, they're missing the
Yeah.
mark. That's right. They're
Yeah.
sinning, baby.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so there's a few similarities, I think, between kind of the Avatar figure, in that they're extremely high being in terms of kind of representing unconditional love. Buddha has loving kindness and metta. Christ forgives his killers on the cross. Pretty incredible
Oh yeah,
Um,
Buddha. I want to touch a little bit on Buddha because I've studied Buddhism
sure,
for years,
big
and
fan.
I'm a huge fan of the story, the allegory, even, and even, what it
Yeah.
represented, and to a lot of people, some people don't know this, but Buddha, can symbolically be representative of a body under a tree. Buddha sat under a fig tree, Buddha under a tree. The tree is the tree of life, your
Mm,
spinal
right.
column and all of that. But going more into, just the basic story of the Buddha. Jesus told the rich man, he said, you have to go sell all your possessions to enter the kingdom of heaven. And so Buddha was, Siddhartha Gautama, he was born in a rich household. He was born having anything he needed anytime he wanted it. And so he never actually had a taste of much real suffering until he got to a certain age where he went out into the public and he saw the suffering, right? And then,
Exactly.
yeah,
Exactly. Yeah. It's a very, his life story is very beautiful. It's funny we're talking about this too, because I just made a TikTok about the Gospel of Buddha,
Gospel of Buddha.
um, which is it's an 1895, I think, is when this was published initially. It was by a guy named Paul Karras. He basically took a variety of Buddhist scriptures and kind of put it together similar to the Gospel New Testament framework, which
Yeah,
so
but this
it's really
this man
helpful.
straight up, of course, this man straight up gave up everything, like
Right.
food,
The story was
practically air.
he was extremely worldly, rich and wealthy, and had like 100 concubines. I mean, it was just just opulence in terms of his wealth. And he initially, in the first 20, I think 6 years of his life, they hid any kind of, the king and his people's father hid in any kind of negative anything from him. And even when he would like go for a stroll outside of the courtyard, they would make sure ahead of where he was going that it was going to be a pleasant thing, like almost like cartoonishly. And so yeah, it's called, I think it's called the Four Sights, I want to say. But basically what he saw initially in this kind of transformative awakening was, he saw a sick man, he saw an old man, and then he saw a corpse. And then the fourth man was a swami or a sadhu. And so he kind of he learned about, in this extremely shortened period, kind of that there's so much more to life and the duality of it. And yeah, I mean, I think what's really significant about him, and so he left the palace famously at night and went off on his own. And he kind of started by being an ascetic like the Hindu sadhus, and he almost died. He realized that wasn't the answer. And so he found what he calls the middle way, which is the path of moderation in the world, in terms of not necessarily, it's, there's a lot of misconceptions around spirituality, that you have to renounce everything and that you have to go off in the
Yeah,
Himalayas in a cave, and like, most very high masters do not say that. In fact, they acknowledge that as a misconception. They say, no, you want to Sri Ramana, for example, never told anyone to go off and be renunciant. You're renouncing your attachment. You're in the world, but not of the world, to quote another guy. Right.
right.
So, but yeah, Buddha, very wise teacher. I mean, an avatar in my view, an avatar in a lot of the Hindus' views.
I mean, he was very
And
interesting, even in the fact that he got to a point where he had to he just sat underneath that tree and said, "I'm just going to sit here
I'm gonna sit here
until I
until,
find
yeah,
out why the world is the way it is." And he's
right,
he's
that
straight up
resolution.
denying every bit of desire, which
Yeah,
they label as a demon, which I mean, I can definitely see that, you know what I mean, from
right,
a Christian perspective. And
sure.
there ends up all these demons end up surrounding him almost like a war or something, but he still triumphs over
It's
them
just,
by not giving in to
yeah,
temptation. So
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. It's beautiful. Yeah, exactly. If anyone's unfamiliar with the story of the Buddha, the Gospel of Buddha by Paul Karras, the best teaching, which is in the Gospel of Buddha, but it's called the Dhammapada. is kind of his kind of Buddhism teaching 101, and it's just a series of precepts that he taught. Very high stuff. Happy to read some of it too, but it's he's as good as anybody else.
Of course. And I think, a lot of Christians want to think Buddhism has to do with idolatry and other things, but even, just looking at Buddhism, they don't worship Buddha as a god, but
That's
necessarily
true.
a figure or a symbol of their own enlightened consciousness. So and I do think, with the different sects of Buddhism that has come about, they're not always on the same page about Buddha and about his teachings and everything, and they
That's
have
true.
gotten a little more dogmatic that we would see, but it's not, the basic principle of looking at that guy who did something good, and trying to follow in his footsteps. That's a great principle.
A great principle. One of my favorite quotes from him, this is kind of just from memory, is he says, like a mother protects her young,
Yeah.
radiate boundless love towards every being. So the relationship of a mother to her frightened child, that's the energy that you should try to capture with every being on this planet. That's the kind of level of, kind of exponential love and compassion that he supported. So
That's
yeah,
like when
big fan.
Jesus said that it's the second is like unto it to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. He says that right after saying love your neighbor as yourself. He's saying it's like loving God when you love your neighbor. He's telling you how
Exactly.
important it is to show that love and to share it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. In the Avatar chapter, I have kind of a list of similar, like, what do I actually say? The primary mystical messages of each of these avatars are: one, the path to peace and its internal nature. Number two is compassion to all beings. And number three is releasing dependence on the external world. All avatars and really kind of, I'd say, high teachers throughout spiritual paths, they're very consistent in emphasizing kind of those themes. And so I have a list of, I mean, even Buddha says stuff. I mean, Buddha says you reap what you sow. I mean, he also talks about mustard seeds. It's crazy,
Oh
kind of
yeah.
to our conversation
There's
topic
even
earlier. There's so
yeah,
much overlap.
there's even I saw a video not too long ago discussing Christ in India, Christ in Japan,
Yeah,
Christ in there was another area that he was, so they have some artifacts from, or people saying they've wrote about him staying there, or
yeah,
different things. And really, there's a lot of people who don't know that there's a huge chunk of Jesus's life where we don't know anything about him. We don't know where he went, what
it's
happened.
true.
We know he went to Egypt. We know he came back and taught he taught the priests in the temple, and then after that we get about, I think it's a
12 years.
12
Yeah,
year period where we just don't know what happened to him. So he could have 100% gone anywhere nearby. I believe it was St. Thomas set up a church in India. That's not very far away at all, at least in their where they're at in geography. So it's 100% a plausible thing that Jesus could have followed a trade route and gone over
totally.
to India and taught, or
I
even
touch on
somehow
that a little
influenced
bit.
the
I
Buddha.
touch on
Yeah.
it a little bit in my book about the lost years of Jesus and kind of being open to the possibilities. I mean, admittedly, Bible scholarship is pretty closed off, but that's okay.
Of course, they like
Is
staying that way.
academia is a little like that. They're a little stuffy, but
We're here for
I
the
think
conversation.
yeah, and the claim specifically is the Hemis monastery in Tibet is one of these places that says, oh yeah, he was here, he studied here, and a variety of people, including kind of respected Hindu monks, went there and verified it in some capacity. And so it's, I'm definitely open to it. But secondarily, kind of to your point about the exchange of ideas, in Jesus's time, the Hellenistic world
Yeah.
was extremely just exchanges of goods and idea. It was a beautiful kind of enlightenment area of antiquity in terms of that. geography in that period. There was just so many different cultural
Early kind of
exchanges.
Renaissance, I guess. Yeah.
Totally,
Yeah.
totally. And the Gnostics, which I'm sure you and I'll talk about now or later, is,
Sure.
the Gnostic discovery at Nag Hammadi. Plato's cave is in there, or Plato's Republic. Plato's Republic is one of the codices in the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library in Egypt, right? So these Christian monks in Egypt were reading Plato, alongside of the canon and
Yeah, the
non-canonical
Dead Sea
Christian
Scrolls,
texts.
as
But
well as, what's interesting about the Nag Hammadi for viewers who don't know anything about the
yeah,
Nag Hammadi library is they found a bunch of Gnostic gospels modernly kind of, more not modern, but modernly according to archaeology. And there was found alongside a biblical canon, as long as the Dead Sea Scrolls, and like you said, some of Plato's work. So there were Christians, early Christians, who were studying
they're
Gnostic
reading everything.
texts. Yeah, they were reading every bit of it. And I mean, I think that there's a good point into reading and researching into other cultures and deeper biblical history and everything, because Jesus says to be as wise as serpents and as harmless as doves. And how can you hope to be as wise as a serpent if you're not reading what the supposed serpent is reading? You know what I mean? And that's in every aspect. So
That's beautiful.
yeah,
Well said.
for sure. And I was talking a bit about just syncretism and how God saves people from other religions, and touching more on like it's unfair to not provide a way in other religions. And I think it's important that, for us as just people who are with an intense intent search for truth, to judge the fruits of whatever we're looking at. There's modern day Christianity has some pretty bad fruits. It said even in the Bible that woe to them who call good evil and evil good, because there will
Hmm.
rise up, people, and rise up people who call good evil and evil good in the final days. And that with the church and the way that it's become so dogmatic versus relationship, built, it's almost like they have started this kind of dichotomy where they look like the Pharisees did to Jesus today to everyone else, and they're running people off. The fruits aren't there. There's religious trauma that thousands of counselors are having to deal with across
Right. Secular counselors are trying to fix the,
yeah,
yeah.
exactly,
You're so
secular
right.
people.
The hypocrisy, right? And the lack of kind of embodying the teaching. And I will say, I shared this with a friend recently. I've done some food bank work, which is really kind of soup kitchen, feeding the homeless work, thanks to Hinduism, by the way, my yoga group. But we went to a church and we served the homeless at the church, and it was so beautiful because they were such real Christians, and we've all known them. And they, small, humble church. And this guy was like, "Can I pray for you, brother?" And it was like, of course, that's a real honor to me that he, that because they're really living the tradition. Whereas, what is it, the Lakewood Church, the mega church kind of stuff and the televangelists, that where such a huge focus is really on greed and power.
Yeah.
And I've seen a couple of guys on TikTok, that I've connected with. One of whom was a former on the board of churches and stuff, and now he's a mystic creator,
Right.
And he he goes, "Bob, 90% of our conversations in these church board meetings were about fundraising."
For sure.
And that is, I thought it was high, as someone who wasn't in those board meetings.
Right.
But it's kind of Game of Thrones in there. I mean, it's like, how can we get more power? And they're looking at the other churches marketing, and so it's just like, is anyone reading?
Right. You
Just
can
read the
look at
synoptics.
right. You can
Don't you
look
don't
at
even, Thomas is great, but
Steadfast Baptist Church, where the pastor there's almost like a dictator. If anyone comes up, even disagreeing with something he's saying, which I mean, a
it's
lot of what
so
he's saying
common.
can be disagreed with, he
Yeah,
shuts them down, tells them to get out of the church, don't come back. Jesus doesn't love you. All this other. I mean, there's tons of videos
yeah.
online about this stuff. Just got this guy running out people who just I think one guy had a prayer request one time, and he was just like, "Get out of here! We don't do that for people." I'm like, "What Jesus
it's
saved you,
you
man?"
have to laugh to not get
Yeah,
angry,
you have
because
to.
it's
You
it's
have to.
such a farce, and
And it really destroys people too, because
it really hurts
yeah,
people, which is terrible.
especially
And
people who haven't had a direct experience to where they can get their validation from that versus, a lot of times people in religion and churches like that are getting their validation from people like that. And that's why they stay in power. That's why they stay, preaching and,
totally,
spewing their false message. Yeah.
and and, and also I do appreciate the community aspect, the fellowship. In Buddhism it's called the
Yeah.
sangha.
Yeah, because I'm in no way
um
trying to attack all churches in any way.
Satsang.
There are many, like you said, who have good fruits, but it's where the fruits are there. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. So
Right,
go ahead. I'm
right.
sorry.
No, exactly. And be discerning, I think, is a good lesson. And yeah, just embodying the tradition. I think what's been really kind of profound to me, or at least in terms of um almost like improving that ability to be discerning, it has been for me closeness to the texts. And I'm sure the same is for you as well. The more time that you um spend either in spiritual practices like meditation and prayer and yoga, or in service to others, or also in reading the material, just reading
Yeah,
the
studying
masters,
and applying it. Yeah,
and
absolutely.
instead of applying it in your life and your relationships, and people around you, and your own exploration, it becomes clear,
Yeah.
when there's hypocrisy, when there's people taking advantage of others, and so on. And so yeah, really, I'm grateful that we have these kind of guiding point, you know um,
Yeah, I'm
finger
grateful.
pointing to the moon, right?
Yeah, I'm grateful that God's kind of left, a law on all of our hearts, that there's something
Exactly.
that we
Your
should
own
strive
intuitive
for within
quality,
ourselves.
and validated by the scriptures and so on, that kind of helps you find the stuff out. And I will say too, I think it sounds like, I'm not sure who your audience is exactly. I think I have an idea of it, but um for folks who kind of leave the church, or are thinking about leaving the church, and then there's kind of an exploratory period, right?
Mhm.
What
Deconstruction.
the deconstruction, which is really cool for me to see, kind of as a mystic, as a universalist mystic guy, who's been in the game for years. Come on in, the water's just fine. But what I would recommend is, kind of, when you're on that exploratory period, go through the buffet line, try the different cuisines, if you will, explore the different texts, explore the different teachers. And then the period after that is like kind of zeroing in. You want to zero in. I mean, what one of my teachers said: don't get indigestion.
Yeah.
There's an exploratory period, and that's super healthy. And then secondarily, Ramakrishna also says you don't get water by digging a lot of shallow wells. You
Yeah.
get it by digging one deep one. So your heart and your intuitive capacity will fire at what, and it might even be a time of your life. For me, it's kind of been periods. It's been kind of 3 to 5 year periods of a tradition, that will be really helpful, kind of, for where I am at that point. But anyway, just useful,
Yeah, of course.
potentially,
Of
stuff
course.
on reflections on the path.
For sure.
Also, I'm
And
not a guru. I'm not a, I've just wrote a book of with a bunch of wise stuff in it that I quoted of everybody else in.
of course, in my deconstruction journey, I deconstructed, I studied just about everything you can study, and I have studied. I've been fascinated by different world religions for years. I've probably studied that since I was about 14 or 15. That's almost 10 years now. So
It's awesome.
I've been super intrigued by Eastern philosophy and all of that for a really long time. But I was trying to think about, yeah. So as I was studying all this other stuff, I found, syncretism, and just talking a little bit about my story. when I found, that the Son, there's this thing inside you that can, it can even prove the gospel of grace, but it also can
Hmm.
happen in other religions, and it's, the science is in all religions. And then I discovered that it's about the Son, and then Jesus, is referred to as the Son in multiple passages all throughout the Bible. Even in the fact that we are plants, to bear fruit for him. We're supposed to grow and be healthy and bear fruit for him, and every bit of the allegory, the Son is there, and it it freed the idea that God is evil from me, if that
Mm,
made sense. It
yeah.
grounded me to understanding, okay, because I don't support all the Catholic doctrine, but there's 40,000 different denominations all across the entire world of Christianity. So, do I think there's saved Catholics? Absolutely, I think there's saved Catholics. Now I had to do this about Protestants, and I was like, okay, yeah, of course I think there's saved Protestants. I was a Protestant at one point in time, a Baptist, but let's not go there. Uh, but then I had to start thinking about other religions. What if there's a righteous man who was born into Hinduism, or born into Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, any of the isms, who didn't have a message about the Jesus the Messiah, or Yeshua Hamashiach, however you want to look at him, from that direct perspective. Who would be God to him in his religion, and could God reach him? And through the fact that Jesus became sin, sin is the sine wave, which is half of the analemma that the sun takes, you know. So if he became sin, he became the sun. There was a reason for it. It's not, again, love is not unfair, it's fair. And unfair would be throwing somebody someplace where they had no hope and there was no chance. There's no way, and
Right.
I look to people even in all these other religions, they'll have visions of Jesus or Yeshua. They've wrote, many different texts about having visions of Yeshua, and not even just texts, because there aren't really so many of those, but just experiences you can look up online. And there's
The
people.
Hindus are huge
Yeah,
fans. I mean,
yeah,
Yogananda wrote, Paramahansa Yogananda is a very high Indian guru he actually is the first Swami to come to America. He landed in Boston in 1920 as a 27-year-old. He died in LA in 1952. He wrote his famous book is called Autobiography of a Yogi, which is a beautiful kind of intro into Indian philosophy, and it's a beautiful story about his life and kind of meeting all these saints and so on. But
Yogananda.
one of Yogananda, a very very high master and loving teacher, a great writer.
Yeah, there was also something, one teacher of Ram Dass, some guru Ram
And
Dass wrote.
Maharaji, Neem
Yeah.
Karoli Baba, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
He
So
said
the
meditate like Christ, and he had a tear come down his eye when he said it, right?
they're very connected because they're operating on a super conscious level,
Yeah.
and that means that you can connect into the higher frequency, and Jesus is high frequency, baby. I mean, it's they get it, they get him, and the Buddhist monks get him, and the Sufi mystics get him, and so
And the fruit's
um
there. You know what I mean?
yeah, it's
Especially with
because
the
it's
Sufis. I
real.
love the
Bec-
Sufis.
because
So happy you
Jesus is a
brought that up.
great teacher. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, these guys, they get Jesus, and you know a few things about that. But what I will do is, I'm not getting any kickbacks from this, but this is a brilliant commentary on the Bible for anyone that's interested in kind of symbolic takes on the Bible. And I imagine if they're listening to your work, they do. It's called "The Second Coming of Christ: The Resurrection of the Christ Within You,"
Christ
by
within.
Paramahansa Yogananda. And it's a lot. This guy wrote a lot. He basically took, I want to say every, but I'll say almost every red letter in the New Testament and wrote about 2 to 3 pages of commentary on Jesus's teaching from kind of this modern Hindu master perspective
That's
of divine
awesome.
within, of inner transformation. And so yeah, I mean, that's a masterpiece. It's a massive work, and it's you only do that if you're
Yeah.
dedicated to the value of
And
that kind of
the
teacher.
Christ within you, that's directly quoting from the Colossians 1:26 through 27, 28, around through there. And it's the sacred secret. And we
Mm,
get the word secretion, secrete, from secret. And yeah,
mm.
so it really does tie all of this together. It is the gospel that heals the sick and casts out demons, and is for the Gentiles or the pagans or the common people that are everywhere else. He says, I've given the mystery to the Gentiles. I forget the exact verse, but he said something because something about Israel, but Israel was doing something. So he says, I've given my mysteries to the Gentiles. It's talking
Well,
about this.
yeah, is Colossians Paul?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, yeah. We can definitely talk about authorship and kind of agenda if you're interested in that. I mean,
We
what
can
I
for a
was
little
gonna,
bit. I've
yeah,
viewed a little bit on Paul. I do think there's a huge problem with the church treating Paul's words as God's words.
he's complicated for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah, but
Um,
they also
he
don't take his perspective as his perspective. They do take it like it would be Moses's or Abraham's perspective, which I don't necessarily put Paul up there with Abraham and Moses. So
yeah, Paul's a complicated guy. He did have some gems, but he ultimately never met Jesus in the flesh, which is an important. A lot of American Christians don't know that. He was a Pharisee,
yeah, he had a
and
claim that God, descended, like the Spirit descended on him and
he
blinded him and
he was a
stuff.
Jewish rabbi on the road to
Yeah,
Damascus to basically he was going to basically shut down a Christian community or a Jesus following Jewish community. It was even proto
yeah,
Christian at that
and
time.
he was
Um,
horrible against the Christians
he was
before
brutal.
this. So yeah,
And then on the road to Damascus, he had what I consider to be, I mean, I wasn't there, but I
yeah,
consider that to be a mystical experience,
yeah, me too.
which is profound and
Said
beautiful.
he
And I
was
think
called up into the third heaven, was it? Second heaven?
essentially a beam of light.
Yeah.
He talks about it, and it's also in Acts or Luke Acts, which is that he saw Jesus as kind of a white light, and he said, "Who are you?" And he says, "It's me, Jesus, whom you're persecuting."
Yeah.
And so, I think the real message there is the love of God, the love of Jesus, the love of Source. It's inescapable.
Right.
It doesn't
Absolutely.
matter if you're going
And the
to f up the
unconditional
followers.
delusion.
Doesn't matter. It's boundless and it's unconditional. But anyway, Paul is a big part of why Christianity got started, with the house churches, and his letters are essentially, there's a highway that you can go to now, even in the Mediterranean world. We know what his path. Bible scholars have very clear pictures of where he was, because he was writing letters. He was writing his correspondence to these small communities.
Yeah. To the other
The
churches.
Galatians, to the Romans, to the
The
those are
Ephesians.
that's Paul saying, "Hey, fam in Rome, this is what you need to do." And they're very personal and they're very human. And then what you have, I mean, and this is kind of, let me just point this out kind of from like a deconstruction standpoint, but um, there are essentially layers of authenticity to Paul's letters in the New Testament. So of the 13 letters in the New Testament that are attributed to Paul, um, around half are disputed authorship. We know for certain Romans, Corinthians 1 and 2, Galatians, we're very, very, very historically likely that Paul of Tarsus wrote those. But for example, the pastoral epistles, as they're called, which are the TIs, it's First and Second Timothy and Titus, almost zero. I don't. Maybe I'll say zero, but I'm not going to stand on that number. But it's the vast majority of academic Bible scholars, Christian and non-Christian, consider that pastoral epistles to be not written by Paul. although they are claimed in the writing that they're
Yeah.
from Paul.
I mean,
And
even just to
so,
think about the book of Hebrews, why would the book written to the Hebrew people be written in Greek? Why would why would it be written in Greek and not Hebrew? Just thinking about
right,
that. Yeah.
it's a collection of a variety of authors, and I think for Christians, that kind of every word in the Bible is true and everything's what it says. And I mean, we just, there's too much evidence that points to say, no, actually, this is a collection of documents written by human beings.
Yeah, even the
there's
very
there's
first
beauty in
in
them, and there's
Genesis, yeah.
transformative power, but but you know they're
Yeah.
the pastorals are forgeries,
Yeah,
and
to
they're
take it
they're in
to
every Bible in every church in America.
course. Well, to take it literally, the whole Bible as 100% literal, this is the word of God.
That's not
This
your listeners, right? I mean,
Yeah, yeah, of course.
probably.
But the whole thing that is, like saying that, oh, this is the word of God, this is infallible, it's without error, the very first place in the Bible that disproves is in the creation story, where it talks about, there's two different creation accounts of man. One says that man was created before the animals, and one says he was created after the animals. Well, if you go back into the original Torah and you read the Hebrew description of it, man was created out of ADM, Adam. This is the Adam Kadmon, the basic template, you could say, for man was created before the animals, but then Adam, the man, as was named Adam, you know, that guy is is that incarnated. So it's like it's
There's
it's
already a
both.
contradiction in the
Yeah, it's
first
both,
couple of
but without
moments.
without that understanding, you wouldn't have that from the basic King James version. You'll read the King James version and be like, "What?"
It really
So
it
yeah.
it really opens up, when you can kind of look at it as a historical collection of documents. And I think a lot of what my work too, John Tyler, is like, I most of the people I most of my friends, for example, and coworkers and peers in my community. I'm in Austin, Texas, by the way, which is
Mhm.
very kind of open-minded, progressive, urban place. Most of my folks are secular, kind of agnostic, not necessarily atheist, but kind of post-religion, if you will. And
Yes.
so a lot of whereas a lot of there's a lot of America as a whole is kind of
I'd say
either in
spiritually
it or working
exhausted.
through it,
Yeah.
or yeah, but a lot of people, right, are kind of waking up to the hypocrisies and challenges and so on.
Absolutely.
And so while some of my work is saying to the Christians, hey, read a Buddhist text, some of my work also is to the kind of secular agnostics to say, don't throw out the baby with the bath.
Right.
There's a lot of real beauty and real value um, in the baby. The
Yeah.
bathwater is dirty. Change the bathwater, if you will. But
Right. I
but
said
but
I
but the
said
master,
deconstruct, but don't deconstruct the cornerstone. You can build back
exactly.
on that cornerstone. Yeah.
Yeah, and I really challenge anyone that's listening that is kind of over it, or kind of sick of all of, like you said, the kind of man-made, really what I would define too as kind of ego made. And so kind of back to the Avatar talk earlier, what happens almost in kind of a template, it's kind of a stereotype. What happens is there's a very high being, they're in present in whatever culture, whatever timeline, doesn't matter. They show up, they preach love and unconditional kindness, compassion, forgiveness, so on. They usually get killed or treated poorly in some capacity. Buddha actually had a very long life, which is somewhat exceptional. But
Yeah.
and then the disciples try to, they usually don't write much. They're kind of they're so awakened, they're not trying to write anything. The disciples are kind of the
Yeah, they're
ones
trying to do stuff. That's
collecting.
why
They're
there's
trying
the
to do the
acts.
stuff.
Yeah.
The master is just being.
I mean, you got to
And
think Peter's the one leading them at that point, and Peter's the hot-headed, one. So
well, yeah, the avatar just is. The avatar is the embodiment. They're the culmination. And then the disciples capture, and then the disciples die, and then it's the followers of the disciples, and at varying rates. there's schisms, and you alluded to Buddhism having schisms that broke off, where this group of followers said, no, you guys are doing it wrong, and this guy, no, you guys. So it's I mean, in Islam, look at Sunni and Shia. I mean, every religion has this capacity, and it's because the ego mind
There's a very strong
of
spirit of
man.
separation.
Absolutely. I would even argue, as a non-dualist, that this is the separation land.
Yeah, yeah,
The
absolutely. I could
avatar
say,
is the unity.
yeah, I could say even, just with what you're, expanding more on the ego thing that you're bringing up, is really all of the most damning spiritual traps that occur come from that ego, that false understanding.
Correct.
There was a story about somebody who misunderstood gnosis, and they took it very materially, and
Sure. The Gnostics had
they drove
competing
their car
views.
into like a semi truck or something and killed themselves because they said they were
Mm,
Jesus
it's
Christ
all
or
the
something.
illusion.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but
it's all
that's
an
what I'm
illusion.
saying. It's not, we're not, I'm not saying that, I'm one with God in the flesh. That's not, I don't get,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't get how
Well,
people.
A Course in Miracles actually calls it level confusion. There's a
Mhm.
term for it. And A Course in Miracles is a beautiful modern kind of scripture, in my view. That's a non-dual text, but it's very helpful from a mystic philosophy standpoint at
Yeah,
making that distinction between kind of the illusion and kind of reality and unreality. It's a big
yeah.
question.
Because until someone really has an ego death, they're not going to really understand what, what you're trying to say. They can't really understand what it is behind, the illusion. They don't really know that until they can experience that. But once they experience that,
Exactly.
they understand, oh, they're, my base self, what awareness, the awareness that lies within me is the awareness that lies within the entire universe. It's,
Exactly.
yeah, it's a
Beautiful.
infinite concept.
Yeah, we're just undoing, I'd say kind of the mystic view is we're just undoing the false, really undoing our own ignorance of ourselves. We're undoing. And so if there is original.
We can talk a little bit about the spiritual science of my screen. Just nothing bad. I'm just gonna have to find a way to make it big again.
No, you're good.
uh why did it do this? That's odd.
Take your time.
Okay, there we go. uh but yeah, we can talk a little bit about the spiritual science behind the avatar phenomena. The sun archetype and the earth archetype are big archetypes, within all stories that ever exist. You can think, on the astrological wheel, Jack and Jill went up a hill to fetch a pail of water, then they went back down. It's
Mm,
every story that you ever can think of is the exact same thing when it comes to that. Now,
earth spirituality versus astral.
yeah, through like spirit versus matter, so to speak. And
Sure.
so there's all the elements of the entire world, the great teaching behind the cycles of time and syncretism and entropy and all of that is that really everything from this, crystal to water to the sun itself to the air is all just the same thing at a different frequency, a different vibration. So what this means is that all all things, from solids, liquids, gases, fire, air, earth, water, all of these can exist in both the sun, as a singularity, and the earth as a singularity. Now, the
Mm,
earth could be depicted as something black that absorbs the light because it absorbs and reflects light back into our eyes. And we can view the sun as something white. Now, already we have a kingdom of light and darkness, but the sun's the avatar. You get what I'm saying? So like
well,
even in
everything's symbolic.
Avatar, yeah, even in
Everything on
Avatar
the
the
level
Last
of form is
Airbender,
symbolic.
yeah, even
Hmm.
in Avatar the Last Airbender, there's earth, air, fire, water. He's a bender of all four. He has to master all four.
Hmm.
It's the archetype of what it is.
Yeah, I really honor a lot of the kind of science and almost like metaphysics of this, and I, I a conversation I had recently with a friend of mine, I was talking about how there's really there's a lot of beauty in the kind of metaphysical conceptual, and I think for kind of intellectual types or people that kind of analytical types, that's a really nice path. And there's a lot of, Tibetan Book of the Dead even has realms and layered. Gnostics have a ton, as you know, have a ton of kind of eons and higher and lower and so on. And I honor that. In the last, I'd say 3 to 4 years for me, and even Hindu metaphysics, it's all realms and layers. The last 4 to 5 years for me has been more about kind of presence, and more about really kind of Zen Buddhism, which is really just all about everything you need. It's right here.
Yeah, just sort of setting in the presence of God. I have quiet time where I sit and I just
Yes,
sort of absorb. So
this
yeah,
moment has everything,
for sure.
and that's really a profound thing. It sounds, almost trite in some ways, or to some people, um but so I honor the conceptual, I honor the metaphysics, and I think that it's valuable for people in certain paths. And at the same time, the last, like I said, few years, I've really just been trying to do a better job even of just being here in this moment. And because I think all the realms compact into it, there's an overlap.
It's a
um
good book. Be Here Now, if you haven't checked it
there
out.
you
It's the
go.
Ram Dass story. Yeah,
Sure.
absolutely.
Be here now. We're always, especially I think modernity, I'm seeing all these crazy stats about how much information the modern human is exposed to. I mean, it's like 33, I think it's the equivalent of 33 newspapers every day,
Man.
from front to back. I mean, it's probably more than that. Even it's anyone born before 1900, it's their lifetime, their information they're exposed to is a day for us.
Mhm.
Um, and so what does that mean? Well, to me, that means that there's never been more ripe of an environment for stillness, for slowing down, for being contemplative.
For
I'm not.
meeting. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't mean don't be ambitious and don't have, I get a lot of things done. I work at a corporation, and I
Yeah,
write a
absolutely.
book and make a bunch of TikToks, and try to be a good husband and father and friend and all these things.
It's
But
like when you come home from work and your mind's racing and you can't slow it down, practice some meditative breathing and some
totally,
pranayama, or slowing
it,
down
it
the thoughts.
it has to be practical. The spiritual path has to be practical. Everything else is secondary,
One
really.
of my favorite meditations is Vipassana meditation, which is it's sort of like a clearing of the mind. And
Yeah, absolutely.
very cool little phenomena you'll notice if you try to think about not thinking about anything. Like if you try to think
It's
about
pretty
not
tough.
thinking, yeah, it is kind of tough, but you'll notice for like a split second there, you actually will think about nothing. And then it'll come back, but you'll start analyzing what you just told yourself. But for that little split second of focusing, you get like a almost like how a Buddhist koan, kind of
Sure.
interrupts the
The space
dualistic,
between
yeah,
thoughts.
yeah, the space between thoughts, or the dualisticness of everything. It'll interrupt it and kind of make your brain take an outside perspective.
It's so true. Yeah. And I'm actually a certified mindfulness meditation teacher as of the past 2 years or so. And one of
That's
the
awesome.
images I really like is where, you're noticing thought in meditation, you're noticing thoughts, and then you're coming back to breath. You're noticing it. And a lot of people that are new to meditation kind of say, oh, I thought about everything, and I can't do it, or it's not for me, and so on. It's like the mind is going to bring you thoughts all day long. And so really what all you're trying to do, the image from Buddhism is you're sitting on the stream, on the bank of the stream, and the thoughts are coming, but
Yeah,
you don't have to
it's
jump in.
it's observing and
You're
not
just
reactive.
observing them. You're
Yeah,
just observing them, and you can even bow to them and acknowledge them in some way. If it's a super important thought, you can even write it down if you want. Maybe it's a
yeah.
creative inspiration that's valuable. But then you just come back to breath. You just come back to breath, and really just kind of not jumping and not letting the thought take you over, is super valuable. And kind of coming back to the Christian piece, and the syncretic Christians, to the theme of your work, the contemplative Christians, particularly in the medieval period, were practically Buddhist monks. There was a lot of breath work. There was a lot of stillness and Zen type of meditation in those abbeys in Europe. Meister Eckhart is an extremely famous, whom Eckhart Tolle, took that name after to honor Meister Eckhart.
Yeah, it's been all throughout
Teresa of
Kabbalah.
Avila.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Essenes.
The Abrahamics are no strangers to this as well.
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah,
precisely. The Essenes even held the knowledge of the sacred secretion long before it became Constantinian. Is the best way I could put it. So yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I believe that. Yeah, there's a great book too called The Cloud of Unknowing, which is one of the things that's really cool about it is it's written by an anonymous author, which is a very mystic, badass thing to do. It's just the author of The Cloud of Unknowing, because he was just a monk in an abbey, and he has very practical step. One thing he says, for example, is he says, have a very short word, and that's your kind of grip on the present. He says God is good, or love is a really good one, but don't make it too complicated, but just have a really short one, and that's kind of the one that you think about. That's your resistance to the mind. So it's a very practical meditation guidebook, and it's written by a Christian monk. So anyway,
of course. That does that reminds me of Ram Dass's yoga teacher, not yoga guru, who he was with. I forget his name. You mentioned it earlier.
Yeah, Maharaji. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, Neem Karoli Baba was his long name. Yeah.
Of course. And he was sitting there, and they asked him how to meditate, and I think they were talking about Christ or something. And I touched on this just a little bit earlier, but he essentially there was just a tear that fell from his face, and he says, meditate like Christ. And they said, how do we do that? And he says he lost himself in love. And it's that feeling, that presence of the divine unconditional love of God, that is the gateway to all of those incredible mystical experiences.
Totally. Beautiful. Well said.
I can even say in Paul's experience, it would probably have felt like a lightning strike because of how sudden it hit him. But believe me, when it hits you, you know it.
Sure.
Incredible.
Sure. And, I'm adding to the electricity metaphor. Yogananda talked a lot about wattage, for example, and kind of in Autobiography of a Yogi, his life story, there's a moment where he's begging his teacher for an experience of the divine. I mean, for years, he's going, please, and he said, I didn't know it, but at the time, it would have been like plugging in a bedroom lamp into a gigantic generator, So in some ways, what we're doing in the spiritual path, by kind of undoing ignorance, if you will, by cultivating a greater sense of compassion and unity and so on, you're expanding your capacity to receive higher voltage. And so so you hit it on the head in terms of the lightning strike metaphor. And so some people go, well, there's no God, why can't I see it? And it's like, well, with all due respect, you ain't ready, baby. You know what I mean? There's another great metaphor too from Autobiography of a Yogi, which is radio waves. He said, for example, radio waves are passing through us all the time. They're passing through us right now. You can't hear them. But as we do these practices, you start to tune your receiver to the frequency. Yeah. And it's just the same way. You start, it gets a little clearer, it's kind of and then eventually you're tuned in, you're hearing the jam, but it's a process. So anyway, that's kind of anytime I basically get angry Christians and angry atheists on my stuff. And so I get grateful.
I have a lot of people,
grateful spiritual people, but
they like screaming cultural appropriation at me because I'm looking at everything. But I mean, if everything's interconnected, there's a point when you can't keep screaming cultural appropriation when you find the same thing in every one of them. So
That's so
you know,
good.
yeah,
Yeah, man.
there's
Yeah,
just
yeah.
that spirit
You're
of
like, no, 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 it's
separation.
everywhere. That's great.
Yeah. And it's
Well,
hard to
here,
show people who have that mindset anything, because they're just like, no, that's not, they appropriated it from here and they're taking all the history all the way back. But then, you can go all the way back, but then you go a little bit more and you'll find what I'm talking about. So
let me give you a piece of encouragement from the Buddha, John, which is, he says, quote, they blame those who remain silent. They blame those who speak too much. They blame those who speak in moderation. There is none in the world who is not blamed.
fair enough. Yeah.
So
I mean, it even said in, I think
haters gonna hate,
the first
basically.
sin really in the Garden of Eden. Well, it wasn't really the first sin, but it was one of the first sins, is when they she wanted to pass the buck, Eve did, and say, oh well, the sin beguiled, or the serpent beguiled me and I ate. And but then, I mean, first it was Adam passed it to Eve, and then Eve passed it to the serpent. And it's always the same thing. Everyone's just blaming everybody constantly.
Scapegoat.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and the only thing you can do to actually rid that suffering is work on you internally, because you're not, you can't
You
seek
know,
to fix the entire world and actually think it's going to
yeah.
happen. You're seeking to fix the way you are currently.
And so personal accountability,
Yeah.
that's a really important point. And, kind of to the original sin piece, I think a lot of mainstream Christianity, where Jesus is the sacrifice of all the sins, he claimed all the sins of the world
Yeah.
when the Romans killed him. Anyway, that's a whole nother episode. But what that does is that absolves you of any responsibility for your own salvation
Yeah.
slash transcendence slash enlightenment and
Yeah, it's
awakening
like,
and
well, I
so
don't
on.
have to do anything
I
then.
don't have to do anything because
Yeah.
he did it. And how dare you say he did it? No, 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 no. His teaching was about unconditional love and
Yeah.
unconditional forgiveness and unconditional kindness and
And if
living
you
an
look
ethical
there,
life,
that's where you'll find him too. If you look there, that's where you'll find him.
and
Absolutely.
teaching oneness and so on. And this whole thing about he was a ransom. I mean, that's really,
Yeah.
that's really has very little to do with what he taught. And that's such a central aspect of Christianity that just absolves people of their own, to your point, their own needs to be introspective and
Yeah.
kind of work on yourself and so on. So
Because I
I'm glad
think,
you brought that up.
of course, I think a bit of pride too is in, you can't have hypocrisy without pride, and pride is just a a false confidence. It's a pseudo
Right.
confidence. It's like the devil's version of confidence, if you want to say that. And to think, oh, I'm so much better than this person because I've gone to church on Sunday and I don't do what he does. Regardless of what he does, it doesn't matter what he does, or she does, or whoever. But to say, oh, I don't want to go and talk to them, I don't want to socialize with them, I can't be as nice to them, I'm going to have a chip on my shoulder, any of these things,
Yeah.
it happens because of pride, which comes from the ego, and it's a false confidence.
And
If
it's
you're
a
truly
Pharisaic.
yeah, because if you're truly confident, you don't have to prove it. You know what I mean? You don't
Right.
have, you're not scared you're going to lose it by talking to somebody you haven't talked to before. You're going to go and show them the love that they've needed, regardless.
I love that. It in the admonishment of the Pharisees, which in some ways has some problems, which I write about. We won't go into great detail there, but basically Matthew's version is a lot longer. But in the core of it, one of the instructions or teachings is, when the Pharisees fast for religious reasons, they wear raggedy clothes and they're very, oh, look at me and look how holy I am. And he says, if you're fasting for spiritual reasons, wear bright colors, you know, keep it a secret. To
Yeah.
your point,
Yeah, basically
it's not about
act like you're
the,
not going through it.
it's not about the pageantry of it, which is what so much of modern religion is based on. And
And
so
that's
kind of
even the reason he says when to give to the poor people, he says don't even congratulate yourself in private, and I will congratulate
right.
you. Yeah, so that's, that's that whole purpose. It's about not being
Absolutely.
flashy. you
Right.
know?
It's just about sincere service, just about
Yeah,
helping people,
and yeah, truthfully.
being grateful to be able to be uh, supportive, and the Buddha says the same thing in the Gospel of Buddha when he talks to a rich man. I mean, it's
Yeah.
all day long. You and I could cover the
Oh, I'm
parallels.
sure. Absolutely. Well, we got just a few little minutes here, so
Yeah.
anything
Any
specific you want to cover
closing?
in the next little bit?
We covered a lot,
Yeah, we have.
which I really appreciate, and
And
I
I for
liked it.
sure am gonna
The
try to get you
tangential.
back on here soon, because your whole perspective and what you do and how you've approached this it's very unique, and I love hearing from you about what you've studied, and you're
Thanks,
obviously
man.
very learned about what
Well,
you're talking
likewise.
about.
Yeah, yeah, you know your stuff, man. I really appreciate your knowledge, and I pointed a few people to. I think you've seen that. I pointed a few
Yeah,
people to you around some of the kind of esoteric Christian, um, realms, and higher and lower type of stuff. And honestly, on my list this year, digging in deeper into the Nag Hammadi library is something I intend to do. So
oh
maybe we'll
yeah,
have
same,
another
absolutely.
maybe we'll have another Gnostic episode
For
or
sure,
something.
we might need to
This
do
will
a
this
whole
will be the
episode
world
just
religion
about the
one.
Gnostic. Yeah,
Yeah, but yeah, no, I appreciate connecting with you, my brother. And
for
yeah,
sure.
if anybody wants to check out the book, it's pretty affordable. It's pretty accessible. I did not charge $25.99 like some new books on Amazon as a book buyer. That's like the worst thing ever. So it's $11. I think it's $1 on Kindle right now.
Word.
And so it really, it's a sincere work from me to kind of help folks understand the beauty of world spiritual philosophy in a sincere way. And originalsinisali.com is kind of where you can see more about it and more about
For sure.
the work I'm doing. But there's something Ram Dass says where he says something like, there's nothing I know more than any of you. I really like that. Your own intuitive heart has everything already. Anyway, thanks so much for the chat, man, and we'll look forward to coming back.
Of course, I can't wait to have you back on here, man. And
Awesome.
just thank you everyone for who's viewing. Thank you for watching. My content is listener, watcher supported or funded. So if you would like to partner with my ministry to help me grow and to help me produce more content, you can do that at www.patreon.com/John Tyler Tuck. And I have the link usually somewhere along the video at this point in time. And I will see you guys in the next episode.
Awesome.